Okay, so glad we have so many people in attendance tonight. And so I am going to run you through a Lightroom Classic class on the masking panel and a little bit of the new workflow that you'll get when you use it. So we are going to get started on this. And as you were told, I'm Jackie Gerse, and he said you'd get to know me. Well, you'll find out I talk a lot. So I do like to explain in depth, and you'll be hearing a lot of detail in my explanation. Hopefully you'll appreciate that and not be totally bored. So he said in an email earlier today to have your drinks and snacks and a soft chair ready to go. Maybe that drink should be coffee, just in case. Something not decaffeinated either. All right, so we're going to talk about Lightroom Classic, and we're going to talk about the masking panel, most specifically, and how to use the new AI technology that is involved with some of the newest updates, and how that masking can affect your workflow. So if you have been using Lightroom for a while, and you are familiar with the masking panel, a lot of this may just be information that you already know. I hope to give you some information that maybe is outside of what you already know. So at least you can go after tonight, you'll be able to say, well, I learned something at least. So that's my goal, is to teach those of you that have experience with Lightroom at least one or two little tidbits of information. And then I know we have some people watching tonight that have little to no experience with Lightroom. So we're going to go down to the basics. And another thing that I wanted to explain, and I put it in red just so that I would remember to read this and tell you about it, is as we go through this class, you are going to hear me say Lightroom almost continuously through this class. Please realize that I am actually talking about Lightroom Classic. There are two different Lightrooms, Lightroom and Lightroom Classic. I have a leftover habit of calling Lightroom Classic Lightroom because that used to be its name. I noticed Jay just did the same exact thing. Yes, there is a masking tool inside of Lightroom, but all of the graphics that you see, all the pictures, those are all Lightroom Classic, but you should be able to find most of these things within Lightroom if that's the one you're using. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the rest of the presentation, but just know that every time I say Lightroom, and you'll hear it a lot, it's Lightroom Classic that I'm referring to. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk again about the masking panel. And this masking panel is all about doing selective editing. So what exactly is selective editing, and why would we do selective editing? Well, selective editing is actually looking at your image and knowing that it doesn't need the same edit to the entire picture. We all know that global editing is available in the basics panel, but maybe you just want to selectively give this one little area of your picture a certain boost. And so we're going to target that. We're going to learn how to use the masking panel to really select just the part of that image that you want to do. And sometimes it can be a very small and detailed little area, such as leaves on a tree, and you might want to do some editing to that, yet you don't want to affect the background or the sky that's behind it. So we want to be able to just work on the leaves on that tree. So selective editing is the ability to then pinpoint just the area that you want to affect. So we're going to get into how you do these, the creation of these selections, and we are going to start right at the ground level. So how do you start getting into the masking panel? It's very simple. On your interface of Lightroom, you will look on the upper right-hand corner and you should see this bar of icons, and we are using this one that's circled in red, and click on it and it should open a panel that looks just like this. If you have an image open and it's the first time that you have Excuse me, there was just told me it was recording and it startled me. Now I got to get my thought pattern back. So anyway, if you have already opened a mask within the panel, it will look a little bit different. But before you have actually made any mask selection in the masking panel, this is what your interface mask looks like. So the top 5 things on the left-hand side are all the artificial or AI based masking or masking options, selection options. And the bottom 6 or 8 are what I consider the manual options. The artificial intelligence, you have little or nothing to do with the way the selection is made. You have a little bit on some of them, but a lot of them you have no control. And then the bottom ones, the manual ones, you would actually physically be selecting the area that you want to have done, and you would manually be putting it in place. So hold on one second. Okay. And so when you go to your mask panel, the very first time from an image, so you haven't been on there, you haven't made a mask yet, your interface, this window will be what you see. And then once you make one mask, you can look in this center image now. And once you've made at least one mask, the interface area looks different. So if you wanted to create a new mask from this as a second mask or more, you will click the plus sign at the top of the screen and it will open another window. And here on the right is the window that you will see if you want to make a second or subsequent mask after that. Now you'll notice that the picture on the right and the picture on the left contain the exact same things. It's just that they are laid out or graphically designed a little bit differently. So don't be surprised if it looks, you see 2 different things going on. Now this screenshot, this screen has a lot of stuff going on. So let's get started with it by let's ignore all the red things that you see. And let's go over and let's look at the picture here on the far left, not the skinny one, but the big one. And you'll notice that when I have opened a mask, and this is what happens if you've not used the masking panel enough that you've decided to change the layout of your screen. This is the way it opens, and it'll stay this way until you actually physically decide you want to change the layout of your workspace. So what it does is it opens this masks panel and puts it inside the workspace. So you're just seeing a portion of my Lightroom screen. And it's putting this window called masks, which you can see the name kind of up in here, in the workspace that you work on. Now, when it puts it up there, you can leave it right where it lands and keep it there the whole time. Or you can decide maybe it's in your way or it bothers you and you want to move it. So to move it, you just put your cursor in this upper bar. And then you're going to click and you're going to drag it wherever you want to within that work area that your image is in. You can put it anywhere inside there, no problem. You can move it as many times as you want. If it's in your way while you're editing the upper right-hand corner, you can move it to the left, to the bottom, to the center, whatever you want to do, you can move it and keep it out of your way. For me, that's a hassle. I don't like to have to move it. And it does kind of bother me when it's in this upper left-hand, or excuse me, upper right-hand side of my screen. Sometimes I'll leave it there, but sometimes I will move it. And so if you decide you would like to move it into this right-hand panel, which this is the right-hand panel right here, all you have to do is look at the center image. If you take your cursor and that little hand will be on it, it'll look a little different than the hand that I'm showing here, but you're going to click in this upper bar and you're going to click and you're going to drag it towards this panel. So you're going to click up here at the top and you're going to drag it towards this right-hand panel. When this blue line appears, all you have to do is release the click on your mask panel and it will drop it into place and it will dock right above what I call the effects panel. So now if we look over here at this first image again, This is what I'm calling the effects panel, mostly because it says effect right at the top. And this is where your sliders are that affect the masks that you're going to make. So it will dock it right up here and you're good to go. Now let's look at some of the red marks that I've made on this screen. If you look in this left picture in the upper left-hand corner, I've got a circle, and inside that circle is that light switch, which that is used throughout Lightroom as a means to turn things off and on. So the way it is right now with the light box in the top, it's on, and if you click it again, it would move to the bottom and it would turn off your entire group of masks. Now, mine just has one mask in it right now, but if you had 8, it would turn off all 8. So you could see a definite before and after as often as you flip it off and on. If we look at the little information here inside this other circle on the right-hand side of the mask panel, you'll see a question mark on the left and double arrows on the right. The question mark on the left, if you were to click that, and if you're a person that loves keyboard shortcuts, you will find that it opens a whole window that shows all of the keyboard shortcuts for the masking panel. So if you like shortcuts, that's where you find out where they are for this particular area of Lightroom. The arrows on the right means that you can collapse the mask portion of this panel. So click on it this way, it would collapse it down to a narrow strip of information. Click it again, it will expand it. When you click it to collapse it, it will look something like this picture on the far left. And you can see just a portion of the mask, just the thumbnails that are representing the masks that are in a mask panel. Now, this one is not the same panel as you're seeing right above it. It's another one. And in this mask panel, I have turned off a couple different masks. So they've got the eye showing with the line through it. That means that was turned off. And then you will see 3 warning signs here. And so if you happen to see these triangles with the exclamation mark, you will know that there is a problem. And so then it's to determine what that problem is, but more than likely it's something that you've done as opposed to the software itself. And in this case, you will look up here and that switch that was turning my mask panel off and on, it is in the off position right now. So that is what is causing those little warning triangles to show up. If I would turn it on, then more than likely those would go away. If by chance they didn't go away, it's probably because the mask that they're attached to is turned off. So one of those 2 things is probably the culprit for the warning sign. So just be aware, if you see a warning sign, you need to look for what has caused that warning sign to show up so that you don't go about editing and have something going, isn't going right for you. Let's look at one more thing on this screen before we move on, and that's over here in this far right image. There's a red circle and it's in that effects panel and it says amount here. So let me tell you what that's all about. And you'll notice that this arrow is right in the center of this bar. If you have created a mask, and we'll just suppose you have made moves on, say, 6 of the sliders that are in the effects panel, and you look at your image and you decide, you know what, I went too far with the effects that I dialed up. I like the quantity of effect to each other, but overall it's too strong, or overall it's too weak. This is the slider that you can move either down to the left if it's too strong and you want to move it, if you want to weaken the effect, or you can move it to the right if you want to make the effect stronger. This has been in there for years. It just used to be hidden and you'd have to open up a little panel in order to see it. Now it's in full view. So let's get into these masks, and some of them are pretty self-explanatory, so we won't do a whole lot. But when you see these boxes, all you have to do is click inside the box and it will decide, these are these AI selection masks. So the Lightroom itself is deciding that this area that you see in the right-hand picture is highlighted in red where it thinks the subject matter is. And in this case, I agree. I would say that is pretty accurate. Is it 100% accurate? Well, I think there's reasons that you could question maybe some of it shouldn't be in there, but it is. And it's pretty accurate, and it has decided that on its own. And if you hit sky, you can see this is what it has decided is the sky in this particular image. So it is showing the highlighted or the red area for what it is selecting to use as a mask. So in my case, on the way I have my program set up, and probably the way yours is too, unless you have changed it, but the default settings will make whatever is in the overlay color is your affected area. In other words, if you moved your sliders, that's the area it's going to affect. Now there, you can again say, oh, well, it missed some of the sky in the framework of that sign, but it did a pretty good job at deciding what was the sky. The background, it has picked it is actually opposite of what the subject matter is. I don't believe it's always that. In this particular image, it is the opposite of the subject. Not much to say about that. That's the way it picked it. So let's talk about the objects selection, because that one's got a little bit more details to go along with it. I told you that the AI selections were, you had no control over most of it. And well, this is kind of a little bit of an exception. You have a little control. You just have to tell Lightroom what is the object that you want it to select. So that's what we're going to learn about now. You're going to click on it. And when you do click this screen with the word objects, it will open a new mask. It says new mask, new objects. So, and until we have picked the area and the mask is actually made, it says new on any of the masks that you make when they're brand new and before you have made a selection. That's what it says. Once the selection's made, the word new goes away. But what you'll see is if your masks panel is sitting inside that work area, you will notice that to your right, you have a mode, and this is where you can select the way you're going to choose and tell Lightroom what object you want to select. You can either select a brush, or you can select it with the rectangular marking tool. So you'll drag it out and drag out a rectangle, and it will tell it that it's that. Now I'll get into more detail in a second. You'll also notice that there's an invert in here. So you technically could use, we'll say the paintbrush, paint in what you want to be the object that you want Lightroom to select. And then you hit invert and it will actually show everything except that object that you painted in. And that can come in handy at times. So if you have docked your mask panel, instead of being out in the window, it's docked above your effects panel, you will notice that this mode is below it instead of, if you don't know where to find it, that's where it is. Again, this one is got the highlighted brush. So that's the one that would be used, where this one was highlighting that rectangular marking tool. So let's look at selecting objects with using a brush. If you look at these three pictures, and on the left one, you'll see the brush tool has come up on here. I circled it in red just to make sure you could see it. And then I have very loosely painted over this sign. And once I release the click on my mouse, it has on its own selected this area that you see in magenta as what it thought I was trying to pick out as the subject. And it did a pretty accurate job. It did grab a little bit of this framework in the bottom left. I don't know why it picked that when it didn't pick it on the right, but it did. And so then the question is it a problem? So the best thing I could tell you is once you select something, even if there's something in that selection that you didn't necessarily want, go ahead and make your sliders move where you think you want them, and then assess whether you need to go in and correct or adjust that mask. And maybe it's just fine the way it is. If it's not, then you can adjust it at a later time or, the next step. But more than likely, it may be fine. Okay, now let's look at how you would select a subject if you were using that rectangular marking tool. So you selected that up here, clicked on it, and you will put a little plus sign on your cursor, which you can't see in this picture, but it will do it. And you're going to say, go up to this upper corner. I click and I drag out the shape that I want. And this is approximately the shape that I drug out. This flower is technically white. Right now you're seeing the selection already applied to it. But I'm showing you how I got it by this red line that forms the box. That was the rectangle that I drew out. And you'll notice that there's some background included in the selection area that I made. And then there's some flower on the outside of that rectangle that I drew out. And yet it still picked the entire flower and not the background when you see it here in magenta. So it does a really good job of trying to understand what you're doing. And in this case, I picked object selection to select that. And I thought, really, I probably could have been using subject as my selection tool. And so I thought, I'm going to try it. And I did. And I thought, sure, it would work. I thought, sure, it would pick that white flower as the subject of this picture. And it did not. It picked the center of this flower as the subject, and it did not pick the white. So this object selection tool ended up being my best scenario for picking the area that I wanted to work on. So now we're going to talk about the brush tool. So you would click on the brush as your option. And what happens when you pick the brush tool as the way you're going to make your selection is you have total control of the characteristics of that brush. You can choose the size, the feather, the flow, and the density. Now over here on this photo, I've just showed you an example of what the difference in feather is between the left line, it's got 100 feather on it, and the right line is at 0. So you can see the hard edge versus the soft edge. And that comes into play when you want to paint next to an area that you don't want to select. You may need a harder edge on your brush, or if you want that nice soft flow, you may want the softer edge, which is at 100. The next thing I wanted to mention was flow and density. I don't know if you're familiar with how flow and density works, so I will explain that a bit. Density is, both of those are sitting at 100 right now. If I decided to increase my exposure to 2, so I had a +2 on exposure, and I had my density at 100 and my flow at 100, and I took the brush and I painted on something, you would see a +2 exposure wherever I painted. If I had my density at 50 and I painted on with 100 flow and 50 density, you would see in one stroke me get 50% of that +2 exposure. So you'd only be getting a +1 exposure. If I had my density at 100 and my flow at 50, then each stroke is going to put 50% of that 100 down. So to get to 100, I would have to color in 2 strokes. So I hope that makes sense and gives you a clue at what flow is. Flow is the quantity of the density that you're painting on per stroke. And density is how far you will be able to get as a maximum. So if it were at 80, you'd only get 80% of that +2 exposure. Okay, so let's talk about the auto mask for a minute, and I'll explain that one if you're not familiar with what it does. Auto mask helps you stay in color within the lines. So if I wanted to color outside of this neon light here, as long as my brush tool has that plus sign in the middle or minus sign if I was erasing, as long as I kept that plus sign or minus sign on the outside of that neon light, it would not cross over into the neon light. That's ideally the way it was supposed to work. So if you had a really soft feather on a brush, you could get pretty close to that neon line as long as you kept the plus sign on the outside of it and you didn't touch it. Once you break that barrier, then it will overflow into the area that you don't necessarily want it to do. Now, masking with auto mask on works great sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't work as good as we'd like it to. So, and it's gotten a lot better, but my warning, I guess, is not to not use it, because I use it too, and it's a neat tool to use. But when you use it, before you stop and say you're done editing, zoom in really tight to the area that you use that auto mask in, and make sure that it gave you a nice, smooth, continuous selection, as opposed to what it can do at times, depending on what you're brushing over. It can give you kind of a mottled or blotchy appearance, and you probably don't want that. So be sure that you kind of check to make sure you're getting the coverage that you wanted when you use the auto mask. Now, linear gradients. So we're going to talk about some of the gradients here a bit. And linear gradients been around for a while. And the way it works is if you select linear gradient from your options, it will put a plus sign on your cursor. You will go to whatever area of your picture you want. In this case, I started at the top, so I clicked and I dragged down, and it will set your linear gradient in place. Now you can put a linear gradient on top to bottom, from the bottom up, from each side towards the center, and from side to side towards the center. You can put a diagonal on. You can make it perfectly horizontal or perfectly vertical. The easiest way to make sure you got a perfectly vertical or perfectly horizontal linear gradient is, before you start dragging out your gradient, just hold your shift key down and then drag it out. It will be perfectly vertical or horizontal, which one you're trying to do. So let's get into more of the details on how it works and what things do what. You'll see two pictures. One of them has the gradient at an angle and the other one is straight. If you look at this one where it's angled, here's your full gradient, the linear gradient, as you pull it out. When I pulled it out with wherever my cursor was, that's what gave me this center mark on the gradient. So I pulled it down from this point. When I let it go, then you can see what we have here. Everything above this top line is going to get 100% of the effect that you're going to use the sliders to achieve. Between this top line and this bottom line is the fade area or the feather area. So you can kind of see the fade happening as we see it. So at the top line, it's the strongest and it fades off into nothing at the bottom line. Now, as you pull it out is where you got the distance between these lines, but you don't have to keep it at whatever you happen to pull that out. So you have the ability to adjust this gradient after you've released the click. And to do that, first off, you can reposition it by clicking on this black box. So click and drag it to the area that you want. So if it's too low or too high or whatever, you can move it. If you think that this gradient is too wide, the feather or the fade area doesn't need to be as wide as it is. There's a dot on the top line and a dot on the bottom line. There's actually a dot below the bottom line, but I'm talking about the one on the line right now. You can click either one of these dots, and you can click and either pull that dot towards the center black square, or you can pull it away from there, and you'll either narrow it or expand it, whichever way you're pulling it. And then you can make it wider. Like I said, you can make it wider or narrow, whichever you want to do. The other thing is it's at an angle. Maybe it's not at the correct angle. Maybe you want it more of an angle, or maybe you didn't really want an angle at all and you just dragged out a crooked line. How do you fix that? This bottom circle, this bottom dot that's below the bottom line is a handle. So if you click on it, it's a rotation handle. So you can click it and drag it either left or right, and it will swing the rotation of the entire linear gradient. You can also hover on this center line. You will see a double-headed arrow when you are out off to the side, either side of that center line. And you can also then click and maneuver the rotation on the whole gradient by clicking and dragging from that point also. Again, to make sure that pulls out at a straight or perfect horizontal or vertical, hold that shift key down. Now there's the radial gradient. So the radial gradient, we've clicked, we've selected it. Now we've got that X back on our, that cross is back on our cursor, and I'm going to drag out either a circle or an oval. And if I want to drag out a circle radial gradient, I just need to hold the shift key down and then start pulling that circle out to the size that I want. And if it's an oval, then you don't have to worry about the shift key, just pull it out, and you can pull it to get, you'll see as you start pulling it, you can make it a narrow one or a short, fat one, however it works, however you want it rather. And so it will be, in this case, it's green and it's filled in. This is the color overlay, and it's inside of the oval that I've pulled out. Now, I never tend to get them exactly where I want them as I pull them out. So you need to be able to reposition it. Again, click on that center button, click and drag it to wherever you want. Now I've placed this one at the bottom, and I shouldn't have done that just for educational purposes because you can't see the entire oval. And so I can't explain what you're not seeing until I get a few slides in from now. So just bear with me a little bit on this. But if you look at this now, this is the area that's going to be affected. Inside the center oval will get 100% of the effect of your sliders. The area between this line and the outer line is the fade area. So that's where it starts to feather off or fade off and gets softer and softer with the effect. It even goes slightly beyond this outer ring. You can see just a hair of the green beyond the outer ring. So just be aware that that's what's being affected and how it works. Now, if you wanted to expand the size or the shape of this oval, we can do it by simply clicking on this upper dot. There is a lower dot down here just corresponding to this. Excuse me, just one moment. If I click and I pull this up, it will expand it from top to bottom, and it expands it in both directions. If I click on a side dot, doesn't matter which side it is, I click and I pull it out, it will expand it or contract it from side to side. If I wanted to keep the proportions of that oval the same as you see now, I could pick on any of the 4 dots on the outside. I know you can only see 3, but I could use any of the 4 dots to draw it out. All I have to do is hold the shift key down as I pull that dot or pull it towards the center or pull it away from the center, and it will proportionately grow or shrink that oval. So let's look at this one now. So I'm using the same exact oval that I had, but you'll notice now the green is on the outside instead of on the inside. I did that by clicking the invert. So on most of these, if not all of them, you will have the opportunity to invert your selection. And so that's what's happening here. This one I use often when I want to create a vignette. But so when we look at this now, the inside of the circle is not getting any of the effect of the sliders. The outside is getting all of it. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Dry throat from talking too much. So it's getting 100% out here. And then the area between the inside circle and the outside circle is the feather. What if you wanted to adjust the amount of the fade zone or the feather? There you'll see a slider right up here. So if I want to increase the amount of feather or the distance that it fades off, I would pull this slider to the right, it goes up to 100, or I can go to the left, which will go down to 0 and will be a harsh, just a solid, sharp line. And as you go up towards 100, it gets softer and softer. So that's one way to adjust the feather. And now we'll move over to the next set of pictures. I'm going to show you a different way to adjust the feather. And so now you can see the entire selection area and my, or my circle in this case that I've used to make that selection. And this is the area you couldn't see on those last pictures. There's a red dot, and I know it's probably small on some of your screens, but this inner circle at the very bottom has a red dot. And then the bottom of this circle, or that oval was the same way, has the 2 dots. The bottom one being the rotation handle. Obviously on a circle, if you rotate it, it wouldn't make any difference. But when you have it on the oval, if you moved your rotation handle side to side, if you pull it side to side, you will be able to affect the angle that your oval is laying on. Now this red, and then this little dot on the ring is the same as these out here. Now this red dot on the inner ring, that is the feather. That's how you adjust the feather, by pulling. So you just click on that red dot, you can pull it out closer to this outer line, which would give you less feather, or you can pull it towards the center dot, which would give you a wider feather edge. And these bottom pictures are showing, this is the medium sized, the left one is the medium sized feather. The right one, the center one has a wider feather on it, and the right one has a less feather. I should have gone all the way out to the outside and showed you no feather at all, but you can see, if you look very closely between these two, it's a little hard to see, but you can see that there is a difference in the softness of this area compared to this one. And then this one is definitely harder. What I've done is just drop the exposure to make that dark in the center. All right, so now we're going to talk about color range. And color range is going to work by choosing a color, just as it says. So when you open your mask panel, and if you haven't made a mask yet on your image, the mask panel may look like this without this little box down here, and you won't actually see the color range option when you initially open, this box initially opens, this window, because down here it says range. Inside this range, there's or right outside there, there's a little arrow on the corner. If you click that, it opens a new box, and in here is where you see color range, luminance range, and depth range. Now, why they did it this way, I have no idea. But so if you have no masks made yet, this is the panel you're going to see, and you will have a hard time finding range until you click on that little arrow in the corner. However, if you've already made a mask for this particular image, then when you go and click create new mask, you will see those ranges that they're just there in without clicking that arrow to find them. So you can see them right away. Why they have 2 different graphics, only they know, I guess. So to use it though, we're going to click on color range. And if you move your cursor onto the image in your work area, onto the image, you will notice that your cursor turns into an eyedropper. So all you have to do is say, well, I want to select the blue sky in this case. And right here is where I happen to pick when I did it. And I put my eyedrop point on there and I clicked, and it created this mask was the area, and it showed the overlay in pink here. So it has selected the blue, and it worked great. What if you don't have the same scenario? And the reason I say that is that sky happened to be pretty much the same shade of blue throughout. But you'll notice in this picture, it's light at the horizon. It gets darker as it goes towards the top of the image. When it samples a color, and Lightroom knows colors by number. So it assigns a number to each color that is available. And if it's not the same color number, or close to it, then it is not going to select it in its mask. So sometimes when we have this gradient happening, or we have a very shades of a color within the area we want to select, we need to move our cursor over onto the picture. And this time we're going to click and drag a box out. And when it samples that entire box, it says, oh, there's more than one shade of blue in here. And it will create the mask you see in the center. Now, again, it didn't cover the entire thing, so that darker set of blues was not represented enough in that sample box that I first made. So can I add to my selection? Yes, you can. So to add to a selection, and this is kind of a common thing to do in either Lightroom or in Photoshop, is a lot of times if you just hold down the Shift key, it means add. So we have it selected from this box, from this point. I want to add up here. So I would hold down my Shift key and drag out another box. And indeed, it did continue to select. So now I have 2 selection points and all of my blue sky has been selected. As with so many things in Lightroom and Photoshop and probably other Adobe products, there are more than one way to achieve the same goals. So you might find that there's 2, 3, or 4 ways to do the exact same thing. And this is the case for this particular color range also. So we could select by color by doing it a different way also. So instead of dragging out a box and sampling a whole area, we could also sample up to 5 points. So I could come down and sample sort of in this light blue area, click once, and it will select the area that is being measured from that one point. And maybe I need to go up then above the selection that it gave me. I hold down that Shift key one more time and I click again. It will measure the color at that point. If I still didn't get all my blue sky, I'll come up here maybe a 3rd or 4th or a 5th time. And with each one of those points that I want to select, I will hold down the Shift key and add in another color sample spot, and it will continue to add on to my selection. You have 5 of those points that are available to you. After 5, and you'll have to do 2 different masks. Okay. Excuse me, I had to take a drink. Luminance range. The same thing happens when you have this initial panel. If it looks like this is the panel you're seeing, you have to open up this box by hitting that little arrow. You'll see luminance range in here. So what is luminance range? That is something that is, luminance is the darks versus the lights. So color before was what we were working on. This is the luminance. So you can kind of envision a black and white picture with white being at one end and black being at the other, and all the shades in between. Those are all luminances from white to black. It doesn't see color at all. It just sees the brightness or darkness of an area. So when you click on luminance range, it will open another box. And in this box, you will see this bar. And it's solid black when it opens the bar. And when it does open it like that, you can't tell which end is the light end or which end is the dark end until you come over and you just simply click on that arrow. And once you click on one of those arrows, then it populates the inside with, okay, this end is controlling my lights, and this end is going to control my darks. So we would pull these arrows in order to either eliminate the darks or the lights. So in this image, you see the white flower and the dark green background. And if I wanted to work on the dark green background, I wanted that to be my selection, I would want to eliminate the white part of it. Because when you click on that luminance range, it turns your entire picture, your overlay color. And I want to then draw away the color that I don't want affected. So let's look at what that looks like. So in this picture, you can see now that just the dark area in the background is showing up in the overlay color. And to do that, what I did is I pulled the white away. So this right-hand end was the light, it controlled the light end. I clicked on the arrow and I drew it down to this point. At that point, this bar was all the way to this line. But that's a very sharp, harsh cutoff from what I've selected versus what I haven't selected. I need that feather or fade area to go in between those 2 points, so it's not such a harsh cutoff, because that will not look good when it's edited. So what you need to do is, if you hold your cursor over the bar itself, there's a little handle that appears. It looks like a little box on the end of the bar. And if you click on it, then you can drag it, in this case, to the left. If we were going the other direction, you would drag it away from the arrow that you've moved. And it puts that fade zone in between there. So that is one way to work this. Let's look at a different way. I told you there's more than one way to do so many processes. This is what I call the manual way, with clicking on the arrow and drawing it down until I see the area that I want to work on in the overlay color. And most of the rest of it is not. But let's look how we can use the AI portion of this and make it work for us and see which one is better. So in this left-hand picture, I've decided, I clicked on the luminance range just as I had done before, and I decided that I want to affect this lightest part. So that's the area I want to select. I've got my eyedropper on my cursor. I'm going to come over, I'm going to click on here, and it immediately selects the area that is going to be affected. So all these things that you see in pink now are what I've sampled over here. And it also has moved for me the position of these bars. So it has already drug the dark away and has left the light, and has put a fade zone in there. Now, if I hovered over here again, that little handle will appear, and I can make any adjustment I want. I could tweak it from what Lightroom has done for me by pushing or pulling this area with that handle, or I can readjust this arrow if I choose to. So you can decide which is the easiest for your particular situation. Now, the next one that we see that was in that range area is called the depth range. And I doubt that you'll use it very much unless you're you do most of your editing on iPhone photos, or yes, iPhone photos. And this is, as far as I know, it only works on iPhone photos that have been taken in portrait mode, which, if you have an iPhone with the portrait mode, you know that's what gives you this, the depth of field here, the in focus flower versus the blurry flowers in the background. So it's working on depth within the picture, and an iPhone in portrait mode creates what's called a depth map, and that's what this uses. If you do not have that portrait mode on your picture, then this will be grayed out. So you won't even be able to click on it. It will have no effect. And 99% of the time, I don't edit my iPhone pictures. And so therefore, and most of my iPhone pictures wouldn't have the portrait mode anyway. So chances are great this is grayed out for you too. But if it's not, and if it is an iPhone picture from portrait mode, then you can take and move your cursor onto your image, and you will see that eyedropper appear. select the area that you want. I happen to pick this one in the background thinking, oh, I'll darken the background and see how it works. It worked great. It's not 100% on its selection, but it was pretty close. Actually, this might be okay. That might be a cutoff stem. I thought it was just eliminated, but what it's doing is it's using that depth map to figure out what is closest to the lens and what's farther away, and then it allows the selection to be made accordingly. It could be that I would have chosen one of these in focus flowers as opposed to the background flowers, but it will select whichever way you want to choose. All right, so we're going to move into the last segment of these selections, and that's people. So that is an option at the bottom. And in this particular photo, there's people in it. So you see the option of having all the people selected, one of the people, or person number 2. And if there's no people in your picture, then the word people will still be here. This part will still be here, but there would be nothing down in here. So let's look closer at this. What we have is the 3 options. I can pick both of them or either one of them. I chose to click on the little boy's picture, and you can see now that he has the color overlay, and that is showing you what would have a selection made if I clicked him. And once you click one of the people or all, you get this new screen that opens. And you'll notice that it has the boy's picture in it. That's the one I clicked on, but it also says I can add people to it. Well, in this case, I could add her to it. If there were 10 people in here, I could choose which ones I wanted to add, or I could just stick with the one. And for that person or the people, what do I actually want to work on? Do I want the whole person, or do I want some portion of the person? So the face skin, the body skin, eyebrows, or this is the whites of the eye. It will select any of those or all of those. So, and then you would create the mask. But we'll say we wanted to add this little girl to it. So I'm going to say add people. And when we come over here, you'll notice there's the add people. I clicked on it over here, so we're seeing it again. I decided not to have the entire person selected, but just his face and body skin. So his neck is part of the body skin. So you could decide to just do his face if that's all you wanted. But if you wanted to do the hands and the neck and whatever else might have been showing, that's where you'd go for the body skin. So because I selected 2, and you could select only 1 or you could select all 8, but with 2 or more, it gives you the option at the bottom to create, in this case, 2 separate masks. If I had selected more than that, it would give me the number of masks of the things I had selected, up to 8. And I could create a separate mask all at one time for one of them, both of them, or either of them. And in this case, I want to go back now and say, yes, I did want to add a person. So I'm going to click on this. It opens this window, and I will check mark her. So I have both of them being edited, and I would hit continue, and you'll notice that it selected her face and her neck. And you can't see her hands. It did select her shoes, because if you look over here, they're kind of the color of darker skin. And so it kind of misread what it was. So if it ended up being a problem that it was selected, I can adjust that selection and remove those shoes from the selection and just make sure it is only on the skin portion of the 2 kids. So once I hit continue, it'll take me back to this screen on the left, and you can either make any adjustments or go on with your create mask. And when you create the mask, then you're ready to make the next adjustments. So the next thing I want to show you before we take our break is customizing a few of the settings within this masking area. And one thing is changing the color overlay. So you'll maybe have noticed at times it was red, sometimes I had pink, or that magenta type pink color, and sometimes it was green. So how did I change it? You'll see a box here, and this is representing that it was magenta at the time I took this picture. And my overlay color says show overlay, so my color was magenta. If I simply click inside that box, it opens up this window, and I can pick any color inside this rainbow area by just clicking wherever it is, or I could choose from one of the boxes down here. I can adjust the opacity, make it more opaque or less opaque. I can choose whether it affects the affected area. So whatever those sliders are going to affect, that would be covered, or which is the default, I believe. Or you can do the two little arrows and see what other options are available. And the other option is the unaffected areas. So if you chose that, then your color overlay would be on the area that isn't going to be adjusted. Now, for me, it's the way my brain works. I leave mine as the affected area, and that's, but either way, you can do either way. Why would you change the overlay color? In this particular image, you'll notice that the glow of this light is very similar to the color of the red mask. And when that happens, it can be hard to see. Say for another example, you were editing a landscape, had a lot of trees in it. If your overlay mask was green, it may be hard for you to tell what is the green of the picture and where the actual mask is. So at that point, again, you may want to change it. So this shows that I've changed it to magenta and or a pink overlay. And maybe that wasn't the best choice for this particular picture. Maybe I would have been better to select green or blue, something that's totally far away from red and orange. But you can still see it in this case. And it does show down here that, okay, this is still red or predominantly red. So it was not affected by the red mask. Over here, it was questionable. Is this the red of the mask or the red in the picture? And over here, it becomes apparent that, okay, it was probably just the red of the picture. So here's a few other customizations that you can make and organizational things. So let's go over what you can do. To name your layers, it's always good to name your layers. You may think you'll remember, and today you probably remember while you're doing the edit, but if you happen to come back and want to re-edit this picture in a month or a year or 2 years, will you remember what they are without kind of doing a deep dive in to investigate what's being affected? Probably not. So it may work to your advantage to go ahead and organize by renaming these to what you have done on this mask. So in order to rename, you just have to double click on the word mask 1 in this case, and a new window will open and it says rename. And then you would type in the name you want, hit OK, and you'll notice that it placed that name on mask 1's layer. There's another way to get on into this too, and I didn't put it on this screen, but when you hover over this bar or any bar, it will, 3 little dots will show up over here. And if you click on those 3 dots, and you'll see the panel pop up here later in this class, you'll see the options, and the very top option is rename. So that's another way to do it if you don't remember to double click on the word. I think double clicking on the word is just faster and easier. In this center image, you'll notice that I've renamed all 3 layers. And I just wanted to point out that you can get a little bit more descriptive on what you have done within this layer. Background layer minus highlights. So you can totally tell yourself what you did. You can see the picture of the area that's been affected, and then you know what you've done. So it's just a little bit easier to figure out. Down here, let's look at these 2 windows. This is in the lower left-hand corner of your Lightroom screen. And this is your workspace up here with an image so that you can kind of get a visual of where I am. So in this bar below the workspace, you will see show edit pins, and mine is set to auto. And there's two little arrows on the side. When you click that, you will see some options. Auto, always, selected, or never. What does this mean? Always means those pins are always showing, they're never going to turn off. The pins being the center of the selection. If it was a radial tool, it was that square little black dot when it was the linear tool, and it's a little brush when it's the brush tool. And so those will always show. Or it could only show when you've selected that particular mask. In this case, this would be a selected mask because it's the one in dark. And then, so only the pin for that selected mask would show if this was chosen. Never means you don't ever see those pins show up at all. And auto means that if your cursor is on the image or on the masks portion of the panel, you can still see that pin showing up. But once you move your cursor into the effects portion of that panel, then the pin disappears, so that when you do your edit by pulling the sliders, you can actually see what's going on underneath where that pin was. So I like mine set to auto for that very reason, because it gets it out of the way and I can see my edit better. The other thing that's down here is called overlay mode, and it's got two little arrows next to this option, which is color overlay, which is what I have going on here. You also will have more options if you click this double arrow, and I'll show you those in just one second. If you notice, there's three arrows. So this whole line is all about the overlay. And there's three dots here, and that means more. That always means more. So if you click on that, it is like this area. You click on it, it opens this panel, and these options are, instead of color overlay, you could choose one of those. So I'm not going to get into those, but I would say go ahead and try them and see if you like those better than the color overlay, or maybe you want to test out using those from time to time during the process of editing. You can also get that exact same options by clicking down here. You don't have to get into this three dot thing. And there's a few other things concerning the pins and so on. Now, if you go all the way down to that effects panel, you will see at the bottom this area down here that says reset sliders automatically. I always keep mine on. What does that mean? Whenever you create a mask and then you draw your sliders to make the effect that you want, so maybe you've increased 6 or 7 different sliders in that panel, and you're ready to make a new mask. If I make a new mask with this checked, all those sliders will go back to 0. So when I start my new mask, my sliders are all at 0, and I can start pulling the ones that I want. If it was unchecked, then what happens is Lightroom remembers what your settings were from your previous mask, whether it be on the image you're working on right now, or from a different image that you had done and created a mask last before you made this one, and it will remember. So it can remember from a different picture even, but it will definitely be obvious and remember from this one. And maybe if you're on the same image, maybe you might want your sliders to be exactly the same. For me, I prefer them just to go back to 0. It saves me from having to go up and clear the settings out. If you did leave it unchecked and all those settings were there and you had a bunch of arrows to reset, the easiest and fastest way to reset those arrows is to go up to that word effects. Remember, I pointed it out because I called this the effects panel. If you go up to the word effects and you double click on that word, it will reset everything to 0. Okay, so the next segment, we're going to talk about how we can take those basic selections and improve them to what we need. So if that selection just isn't quite right, what can we do to fix it? So in the case of this one, picture, you'll notice that there was a little spillover to the framework of the sign. And if when we get in there and we start making the adjustments with the sliders that we wanted to, if it's still obvious that these are selected, and it may or may not be obvious, but if it were, and we thought we needed to get rid of the the selection down in here, we can decide what is the best way to get rid of that, because we can erase it away. And so what we're looking at here in this left-hand image is the way it appears, particularly if you have multiple masks, but when they collapse, these layered masks will collapse a little bit. There's more information than what we see just right here where it says mask 1. So if I click in this dark area anywhere around here, it will expand that window so that we can see all the different components that are a part of mask 1. And inside that component area, you will also see the ability to add to your mask. So maybe the mask wasn't covering the whole thing. Maybe we wanted to cover that framework, so we needed to add into this portion of the picture. But in this case, we wanted to subtract. So I would click that subtract button and it will open another panel. And in here, you will see all the same culprits that we've been seeing before. At the top, though, it says subtract from mask. And so that clues you in that it's not just selecting a new mask, but it's going to subtract from the mask that we're seeing. So as I look down the list, I need to decide what type of selection I think would work the best for the process of erasing this portion of the selection. And I chose brush. I also want you to notice that every single one of these options have an icon to the left of the word. And in that icon, you'll notice there's a minus in each and every one of them. If we were looking at the plus button options, it would say add up here, and then all these would have plus signs. Just an FYI that you probably figured out. But I would click on brush, and then I would go over here and I would have full control of the characteristics of that brush. So if I wanted to remove the entire amount here, I would want to make sure my flow and density is at 100. If I wanted to get really close to that, say that neon line there, I would want to bring my feather down somewhere in the low numbers, maybe all the way to 0 or just slightly above there. So I can get fairly close without leaving a whole lot left over. And then I can adjust the size of the brush. And I would then brush away what I wanted, and I get the outcome to look like this, the one on the right. So now here's another way to refine a mask. And let's look at the picture on the left. This was the straight out of camera. And I looked at the sky and I thought, oh, it needs some work. I want to bring the details out in it. So I was going to do a select sky, which I did, and I made some adjustments to it. I didn't put the photo of the adjusted sky in here. So just take my word for it. I have selected the sky with that easy AI selection tool, and it made a selection of the sky. And here you can kind of see it did get darker. There's more detail up there. And but now I'm looking at this picture and I think this bank of trees would look better if I could lighten it a little bit. And maybe I want to bring up those highlights that I'm seeing in the leaves, and maybe even bring up the shadows a little bit. So how can I select this group of trees? And I decided I was going to go ahead and use the radial gradient. So I chose radial gradient and I drew out an oval and I placed it with the 100% effect in the middle of this tree area. And I went ahead and did my sliders, plus contrast, plus highlights, and plus whites. And what happened then was within this feather zone or this fade zone is the sky and trees. And so the sky is also getting an effect of this. You can kind of see where the effect really feathers off here, but it's getting the effect the entire way. And it ruins the area next to the tree. So I really don't like what it's doing out here. So I need to get rid of that. So I need to erase that away so that it doesn't get any effect. It's also affecting down in the water, but it doesn't seem to make it look worse. I think it looks good. I'm actually seeing detail down here. So I like it in the water. I just don't like it in the sky. And here you can see it without the ovals overlay on there. So gives you a better view of the fact that this has got this really white line around here that we want to get rid of. So how do we do that? Well, I want to subtract from that radial. So what I will do is I will go up and hit the subtract button. I have all those options again to choose from. So I want to get rid of the sky. So gosh, what if I just subtract from the mask with a select sky? So I clicked on that and it immediately took off the portion of the sky, and it did a great job around all those leaves and branches and things. If I would have tried to paint that away with the brush tool, it would have been much harder. So this was slick as can be. It took it away. So here's what it looked like without the color overlay on it before that was removed. And here's what it looked like after it got rid of it where I didn't want it. So that's a nice way to do it. So you can subtract, use the subtract button. Let's put this mask panel to work, and we're going to show it in a workflow of an entire image. And so the first thing I do want to cover though is I had told you that you could use that radial gradient for making a vignette. And this is kind of out of place really in this program, but I'm going to go ahead and talk through this right now anyway. If you wanted to put a vignette on your picture and use the radial gradient, it's a great tool for it. You don't have to keep it centered over the picture. So if your subject matter is off to the side, down in a corner, you can go ahead and put the center of your vignette on your main focal point, and then go ahead and have your vignette off center. And that works great with this tool. So the way I do my vignettes are, if you'll notice, and this is also a reason to bring this point up, is radial gradients and linear gradients can actually be out in this workspace. It doesn't have to only be inside the picture. So you can expand the edges of the workspace when you use those two different filters. So what I would do is, in this case, I will draw out my gradient. Now, if invert is checked when I draw out my gradient, then it will look like this. But if it is not checked, that invert box, then what I will get is a gradient with the center being green. And for a vignette, I want the effect to be outside of the radial gradient. So I will want to check that box, invert, to invert it at this point if it isn't already there. So I draw it out. Now the effect is on the corners in this case where you see the green. And at this point, I will make my adjustments to vignette it the way I want, whether it's with exposure or saturation or clarity, whatever it happens to be that you want to do as your vignette, you can do it at this point. And the other thing, let's see, there was one other thing. Oh, I didn't mention was, if you notice, the workspace is showing a lot around the outside of this image. So my image is not filling the frame of that workspace. the very first thing I did was zoom out so my picture was smaller so I could get to the handles that were going to fall outside of my image. And so that's how I do it. Now at this point, I would go ahead and fill the workspace with the size of my picture. So I'd zoom back in so it was larger in there, and then I would make my adjustments so that I could see it. But so zoom out first, make your image small so you can get at the handles, create the radial filter, then you can zoom back in. Okay, so here's a kind of a workflow thing for this picture. So this is going to work with the people selector on your mask tool. And the workflow for this would start with evaluating the picture that you have in front of you that you're going to work on. What exactly is it that you want to do to it? Do you like the color? In this case, we're going to talk about this particular picture. Do I like the background? Well, when I exposed this picture, I exposed for that background so it didn't blow out. I thought it was good. This is straight out of camera. And I used a fill flash in order for the people to be balanced with the background, which I think they are. However, I think that they are balanced quite nicely, but I want them to stand out from that background a little bit more. So before I even start my edit, I know that I want to lighten them up. And I think I can probably keep the background as is pretty well. If anything, I might add a little saturation or drop the highlights. So that's a possibility. Maybe I'll add a vignette, but there's not a whole lot of other things I need to do. So how can I achieve those three things that I just mentioned? Well, the first thing I thought, I'm going to open my masking panel, and you'll notice then that all 10 people have individual places that I can pick them individually to edit them, or I can pick all people. And in this case, I wanted to do everyone. So I selected all people because I wanted to lighten the whole group. And I wanted the whole person because I thought even, yes, their skin could be lighter, their faces, but I thought their clothing too could be a little bit lighter. So I'm going to do the entire person. I hit create mask. And so what happened then is if you look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner, that's straight out of camera. And then the one below it, I have used that mask for select all people, and I have added exposure and white to the people, and they are lighter. And so I think they stand out now more from the background, yet I don't think they're overly lit. So I'm happy with the way they look for the most part. Now, when I took this picture, she came in this nice bright white sweater, and it was very pretty, and you got to work with what you have. But I thought, oh man, she's going to stand out from the rest of the crowd because she is dressed in such a light color. And then I just went and lightened the whole group. So the sweater wasn't bad in the upper picture straight out of camera. But when I lightened everybody and everybody's clothing, hers got lighter too. And now it really draws my eye to her sweater. And that's not what we want at all. So I want to know how I'm going to get rid of that problem. And to do that, I'm going to use my masking panel. Now, his shirt could be handled the same exact way I'm handling her sweater. I didn't think his was quite as bright, so it didn't bother me as much, but I could do the same thing for him too. This time we're just going to do her sweater. So when I looked at this, I decided I'm going to subtract from my mask. So the mask was on all the people. I'm going to subtract from that. I thought the easiest way probably would be to select objects. I could probably have brushed it out, but I would have had to be a lot more cautious. And I thought select objects might be the fastest way to go. I could have used a brush for that too, but instead I decided to draw out that rectangular tool, and I just clicked and dragged it over her sweater. And yes, I got some of the girl's dress in there. Yes, I got the guy's sweater and her hands, and it still made this selection. So if you look to the far right, this is what it did. It removed just her sweater from the selected area. So everything in pink is going to get the effect of lightning, yet her sweater will not. And so you can see now when we look, the original, this is with everything lightened, including her sweater. I've lost all detail in the texture of the sweater up here, yet it wasn't blown out, but it still was very bright. And then over here, I've just removed her sweater, so you can see everything else is lighter, but her sweater is equivalent to what it was in the straight out of camera picture. And for me, that worked. So it's still light, but it's not near as eye-catching as it was in that last, before I removed it from the selection. So that's a neat way to remove something using the object selection as opposed to the brush. Now, what else did I mention? I mentioned that I could add maybe some saturation to the background. So to do that, I just went to a mask and created background. I clicked on background and it created this mask. Is it 100% accurate? No. You'll see that it got some of her boots and it got some of his shoes. So it caught some legs and some shoes and stuff, and her hair a little bit. But for the most part, it was pretty good. So you can go ahead and move your sliders and see if it needs to be erased from those areas, or if it was not a big deal that it was included in that selection. In this case, it didn't make a big deal, so I left it there. And then I was going to add a vignette, and you can kind of see how I drug that out, and it would have been following the same course that I talked about in just a couple slides ago. So that's another way to do an edit and a full workflow for that particular picture. I guess at that point too, I would have been saying, okay, now do I do the sharpening, or do I need to do noise reduction or something like that? But that was pretty comprehensive for what that workflow on that particular picture was. All righty, then we'll move on. All right, so another option you're going to find in these menus is duplicate and invert. And so we're going to kind of use this in a workflow and see how it works out. But the question is where to find it. Well, I'm telling you, it's in these little 3 dots. So the more things. So if you hover over the mask 1, 3 dots will show up here. You won't see both of these sets of 3 dots at one time. It's as you hover on the layers, you will see them. So where do I find duplicate and invert, and what is it? Well, first we'll go over where to find it, and then I'll explain what it is. If I were on the mask, and this is representing the mask as a whole, and this is the component of how I created the mask. If I hover on these 3 dots and actually click on them, I will get this window open. And in here, you'll notice it says duplicate and invert mask. So that's what I was wanting. So that was affiliated with this top row. But I did see 3 dots down here. Is it in here too? And if you click on the 3 dots, it opens this, and no, it is not in there. Duplicate and invert is not in the options. It does say, by the way, there's that rename that I had mentioned earlier. It does say invert. So I could invert the mask that you see over here, which would then select the mountainous area as opposed to the sky. Here's intersect mask width. We'll talk about that after we're done with this part. Duplicate sky. So I could make another mask that looks just exactly like this one. I could hide that, which I could turn the little eye that's normally here too. I could click that off and on easier than getting into this menu, but that's an option. Or I can delete sky 1. So notice up here, this one says delete all masks at the bottom. That's because I had more than one mask in this particular one. I wanted to tell you that when you delete, if you would accidentally hit delete all masks and you realize you say, oh my gosh, I just got rid of all my work, just do a Control-Z to get back to where you were. So don't freak out too much, just go back in time, just 1, 2, whatever steps it takes to get them back. It's probably just one click if you immediately realize what you did, but that is possible. Make sure you know which one you're deleting when you hit the delete key, or when you press the delete option there. So anyway, we will want to pick out duplicate and invert mask from this top row. Now, what is it doing? Well, it's doing exactly what it says. I had selected the sky for this particular mask, but now I want to duplicate that mask that I just made for the sky, but I really didn't want the sky again. I wanted the opposite. So it's just a real easy get to instead of making an entirely new mask and then figuring out how to select the foreground in this case, I could just simply duplicate it and it will invert it so that it shows the opposite of what I had just selected, which was the sky. So here's what it looked like when it was duplicated and inverted. And I clicked this, and so I got that. So notice too, then what it does is it makes a new mask layer. So under here is the mask where the sky was. It collapsed that and makes a new mask layer, and it puts the component of how you created the mask, which was a sky selection inverted. And so now at this point, it also brings over it duplicates the sliders too. So at this point, you can readjust those sliders if they're doing something to this area that you didn't want. You can fix it at this point. And in our case, we're going to take this a little bit farther, but do you have any questions about that duplicate and invert? So I told you we were going to use that duplicated and inverted mask, and we are here in just a second, and we're going to use it with something called Intersect Mask With. So let's talk about what this is. Intersect Mask With allows you to create a mask that includes more than the area that you want, because it's an easy selection, and then to remove the areas that you do not want within the mask, or to select what you do want to stay, and then it gets rid of the other part of it. So as with many processes in Lightroom and Photoshop, there are many ways to achieve the same results, and this one is going to show you 3 different ways to do an intersect mask with, and you get the same results with each one of them. So let's dive into this. And I told you we were going to continue on with that last picture, which we are, but we're going to stick another edit in between there. Sorry about that. I kind of messed up that order just a little bit. Anyway, this is an intersect mask with. Here is my original picture. And in this picture, I was working on an edit, and I was trying to make a high contrast black and white. And so at this point in time, I was looking at the image, and I thought the snow that's showing up in this general area on the mountain and in this valley on the mountain looks very dirty and gray. And so I want to bring out that contrast again by making that snow white in those areas without affecting the mountain dark areas. Because if I were just to select it and just simply lighten everything, and then the dark's going to get lighter along with the snow, and that's not going to look good. So how can I just select the snow? Well, my first thought is if I pick out the mountain as a whole and then get rid of the dark part. So that's my goal. I'm going to pick out the mountain as a whole, and then I'm going to get rid of the dark, which will leave the snowy areas. So what I did is I picked object as my selection tool, and I drug out a rectangle over this entire mountain range area, and it made this magenta selection. Now, what you'll notice is it did not select these back 2 mountains, and it did add this odd little bump here. And why didn't it select these two mountains? They were still within that rectangular selection tool that I used. So they were not selected, and this is not a knowledgeable guess. It's just a guess on my part. They are deeper into the picture, so that I think the depth of field was affecting what was being selected. It did select this one, I think, because it was closer to being on the same plane as this front mountain, but these were just a little bit farther in the distance. And I think this little blurb here was probably also a little closer to the same plane as this mountain, so it made that selection. I didn't really want to adjust those back mountains anyway. Had I wanted to adjust them in addition to this, I would have then made another object selection and selected just those mountain areas and see if I could have got those in the same area. But for this will work just fine for me. So now I need to figure out how I'm going to get rid of the dark areas. And for this particular situation, I think doing a luminance selection would be my best bet, because we're working with darks versus lights. So to do that, I'm going to go and I want to use this intersect mask width. And so I'm going to go over and I'm going to look for that. And where do I find it? So if I hover over, I get these 3 dots again. If I hover, I will find intersect mask width on both of those. So I'm going to just pick one. I went with the bottom object one because I want to remove it from the object. I click intersect mask width and I get luminance range down here. I'm going to select that. It opens the window with the luminance range in it, and it gives me the bar. And so this one I'm going to do manually. So I want to remove the dark. So I'm going to click on this, one of these bars or one of these arrows, and it will give me so this is what I was just showing you. It's going to give me this bar that shows the light and the dark. So now I know which end to pull away from. I want to pull my dark in towards the light so I lose the dark. But what I want to make sure I do before I start my slider move is I want to make sure this show overlay is on. So I check mark that. And the reason is that would have shown all the pink area. And as I pull this, you'll see the pink area disappear. So I'm going to have that show overlay on, and I'm going to click and pull towards the light. And you'll see as I clicked and pulled, this was the screen. I got to about here and I thought that's what it looked like. That's pretty close to what it looked like at this point. And then I just need to separate them to get my fade zone. So I'm going to hover on this bar. I'll see that handle, and I pulled this bar to the right a little bit farther. So I have a fade zone in there. And now you can see the resulting area that's being affected by this mask. It's wherever the pink one or the pink is showing. And I thought that was pretty good. So I was happy with this selection. And this is the original. And then after I moved my sliders to lighten the snow, this was using that mask. This is how the snow looked and the mountains. So you see that the snow did get lighter. The mountains stayed the same color. So I was pretty happy with that. Before I move off of the screen, I wanted to point out one other thing. I told you that I made sure that this was checked on so I could watch my mask disappear. There's also a little checkbox up here that says show luminance mask, and I could check that. And you might think, well, that's what I want to do. I want to show that mask so I can watch it disappear, which it will do. However, it puts the luminance mask over the entire image. And I really just want to see the mask area that I'm working on. So I do not check this button. I check show overlay, because it's showing me my mask that's already in place. All right, so let's do a bigger picture of there. Maybe will help you see it a little bit better. You can see the snow is pretty gray here, and you can see that it's white here, yet the greenery area of this mountain is still the same. Now there's more than one way to do this. And the other way to use luminance range was to use that eyedropper method, if you remember from earlier this evening. And all I have to do is select luminance range, just like I did before, but instead of starting the manual dragging of these arrows to the places that I want, all I have to do is bring my cursor over the image and then click. So it would be this image. I would bring it over to this area and I would click in this snow area. You can see the pin showing up right here. And when I did that, my overlay instantly changed to look like this. And I looked at my range, luminance range bar, and this is what it did. So it instantly made the decision and it placed the luminance, or it evaluated the luminance and it made its call on what should be the feather area and how what should be affected to get that part of the image done. And I thought, well, I'm not sure that I agree, because there's a lot more of the dark area being affected than when I did it manually. So I thought, okay, I want to compare these and see what I think. So when we look at the before picture, you'll see the gray snow again. And if you look at the after picture, you see the snow being lighter. And as I looked at it, even before I compared it to the one that I had done manually, I thought, I think there's a lot more depth and detail in this area of the mountain. I think I'm going to like this AI version better than my version. So let's compare the manual method, which is up here, to the eyedropper or AI method down here. And I find that I do like the AI method better. So bringing the area down to just affect, in this situation at least, just affect the snow, I didn't think was as beneficial as it was to leave a little bit more of the area affected, because I got so much more detail and depth using the AI method. Now, there's one other little thing that I want to talk to you about right now, which is this hidden intersect button. So we've been using the intersect mask with, and I always have to find my three dots, click on it, open that menu and get to it. But there's this little hidden thing that you can do. It's a keyboard shortcut to bring up the option of intersect. And so all I do is I held down the Alt button on my, you would hold down the Alt button on your PC or an Option button on your Mac. And all of a sudden these two add subtract buttons disappear and the intersect button pops up. So at this point, while you're holding down the Option or Alt key, you'll just click on intersect and then you can start placing your intersection there. You'll have the option to, you'll have that same menu where you can pick the luminance range and then go on from there. We've got a little bit more to cover, and I know it's getting long in the evening, so I will try to get through this. It's just a few more slides and we'll be done. This is straight out of camera. So this image was straight out of camera. I wanted to do an edit on here, and I thought, I went into my basic area and I wanted to see what we would do if we just simply went to landscape. I did that for my profile. I did an auto tone when I clicked on auto in the auto tone section, and this is the edit I got. But I thought, I wonder if I could do something more creative or better by just using the masking panel. So that's what we're going to see now. So I went in and I made a mask, a sky mask, because that was the first thing that I thought. I know there was more color in that sky when I took the picture, but because I was shooting raw, it was kind of washed out. So I went in, made a sky selection with the AI. It selected it. Then you can see the sliders that I moved to enhance the color of the sky. All right, so at this point now, my sky has been selected, but I want to work on the foreground. So this is where I use that duplicate and invert mask that I had talked about prior to the mountain picture that I had just edited. So it did select the foreground. Now, what it did was it applied the same sliders that it had done on the sky are now being applied to the mountain, which is what I didn't want to do because I could have done that globally in my basics panel. So what I thought, it's fine for maybe this upper part of the mountain, because this is my thinking process, because the sun is setting and it could be a warmer glow in this upper part. But I'd like this area down here, which has got a lot of busy details going on, and it kind of takes away from the sky. And really, I wanted to see that pretty sky. So what if I removed this effect from this area? And how could I go about doing that? And you'll see that's what I did down here. At this point, you could decide whether you liked it or not. It's just an example for our class. But what I did is I went over, and you can either do that hidden button trick that I just showed you, or you could go to the three little dots and you will see intersect mask with. So I clicked on that, got this other drop down, and I decided to select radial gradient. And I clicked on it, and I then drew out my radial. Now, the way these work is that when you choose intersect mask with, what it is doing is it will take the first mask you made, and it's like you overlaid that second mask you've made, and wherever they overlap or intersect is the only part that is usable. So it will throw away anything that is outside of that overlap zone or intersect zone. So that is what has happened. So I put this overlay, you can see the overlay of the oval here. It's giving it the full effect here in the center, and then it is fading off as it goes through this feather zone, and then nothing is going to happen out here. And so you can see this is back to what it was originally, and then it fades in until I get full effect up on this mountain. So repeating myself again, that intersect mask with means that only the parts of the mask that are overlapping or intersecting are going to show. And within these masks, you can invert those components if that works better for you. If we would have inverted this oval, or excuse me, radial gradient, then it would have affected the outlying area, and then this would have gone dark and this would have stayed light. So also wanted to point out that you could have different types of combinations. I showed you just a couple of combinations using luminance, but you could use luminance along with a radial. You could use a linear along with a radial, or along with an object selection. So you can choose whichever combination works for your particular image. So one last frame here, you'll see that the intersect mask would have been found either, if you went here, you see intersect mask with, and then I could do a radial gradient is what I had selected here. So under these three dots for this particular mask, it's there. If you hit on these three dots and it opens this, it's there also. So it's the same, it works the same no matter which one you click, so you don't have to fret over which one is right or wrong. You can use either one of them. The third option is you could go to the subtract button. We had the entire foreground selected of that mountain, and we wanted to subtract part of it from there. How are we going to subtract that area that was outside of that radial gradient to get rid of it? Well, what you can do is you can go ahead and select a radial gradient just like we did here. But what you're going to have to do is, once your mask is formed, you're going to go up and you're going to find that invert button, because otherwise it's going to subtract what's inside the radial, but we wanted to subtract what was outside the gradient. Did that make sense to you? So you can do it any of these three ways. If you use the subtract button, you just have to remember you're subtracting. With this particular radial, you would be subtracting the part maybe that you wanted to keep. So in other way, the other thing you have to remember is now I have to invert that. So it's subtracting the outside of the gradient. The one thing I want to mention, and this is the only time that I'm actually really talking about Lightroom as opposed to Lightroom Classic, this is the only time, is that when you are using Lightroom, and I don't use it routinely, but I know this for a fact is still true because I just checked it out before this class started, is that if you want to use Intersect mask width, you won't find it in Lightroom. It's not there. So you have to go about using this method. You use the subtract button when you're in Lightroom, and then you'll have to make sure if the area you want to subtract isn't being subtracted, you may need to hit the invert button. But they just don't have Intersect mask in Lightroom right now. It's only in Lightroom Classic. So that's all I've got for you this evening. I hope you are still awake. I hope you learned something. And even if you're an advanced user, I hope there was some little bit of information that I was able to give you this evening that would help you advance your use of the masking tool. So now, do I have any questions from anyone about anything through the entire evening?